Okay, thanks so much. Thank you for that introduction, Melody. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really exciting to speak with you all. I wish that we could all be together in person. Thank you, Jonathan, for the shout out on the bolo tie there. I'm looking at the chat as I talk. So I wish we could all be together in person, but I obviously think that this is a great alternative. And I'm just really excited to be here to discuss some of my ideas from a forthcoming article that talk about some ongoing work that I've been doing at the University of Idaho. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in with a screen share here. So let's put that on, and then we'll come over to this presentation and we'll try to make this big, I guess. Okay, so just let me know if there's any point where people don't have a good view. I think we're going to deputize Melody that she can interrupt as needed. We do have quite a few people on this session, so it's probably good to kind of relay any like questions or concerns through the chat box versus hoping that someone will see you raise your hand. So with that, let's just dive in. So the title of my presentation is Looking Beyond Cost. OER is Intentionally Engaged Social Justice. My name is Marco Seiferle Valencia. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm the Open Education Librarian at the University of Idaho Library. I'm also the technical director of a project called Chicana por mi Raza, which is a digital memory collective that collects oral histories of Chicana activists in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So I like to start any presentation, especially an important one like this, with some context. So this is a photo of a sacred area near where I grew up. This is Shiprock, New Mexico. I would like to just be very clear here that this is an area that is especially sacred to Navajo or Dene people. And I myself am not Navajo. I am Latinx, Native, and white, but via ancestors from all over New Mexico and then immigrants and settlers. So I like to just be very clear about that to make sure that I'm not appropriating any kind of cultural identity there. But I did have a very strong formative connection to the land in New Mexico and my own relationship through it with my own indigeneity. And it's an important touchstone for me because the area that I grew up in, high school counselors, thought encouraging advice for me was like, you can get a great job working in the mine, like you're a really smart person and you're going to make like a really great coal miner. And so there's a lot of ways that education and especially higher education was really out of reach in the kind of picture that was painted for me in formal education systems. So I also want to contextualize this a little bit with a quote for today. So I have terrible pronunciation on things, so Portuguese speakers, please forgive me. So this is from Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Heart. And he's saying, it's imperative that we maintain hope even when the harshness of reality might suggest the opposite. On this level, the struggle for hope means the denunciation in no uncertain terms of all abuses, schemes, and omissions. As we denounce them, we awaken in others and ourselves the need and also the taste for hope. So this is kind of a sort of a pretty profound quote, and in some ways we're just talking about curriculums and OER and, there's kind of, I think, a connection between these high ideals and what we're doing on the ground and in practice. And I especially like the way that this quote says that we really need to call out abuses and schemes and omissions. And I think, like I mentioned, growing up as a transgender, two-spirit, Native, partially disabled person in a really rural place in New Mexico, I experienced all of these things in the educational system, right? Outright abuses, sort of structural disadvantages to keep me out of places, and then the omission of seeing myself in curriculum. So this quote really resonates with me in terms of my own history. And I also think it's a hopeful quote given the obviously very challenging realities we all face in 2020. And so I also would just like to acknowledge that I'm joining this call from Moscow, Idaho, which is the traditional homelands of the Nez Perce people. This is a land grant university, and I would like to just kind of acknowledge the complex relationship land grant universities have with Indigenous people and the land that they occupy. So thank you to the Nez Perce for all the support that I personally received from Nez Perce community here. And I hope to be doing some good work with this presentation that supports all Indigenous people, including myself. So open pedagogy at the University of Idaho Library is something that I'm sort of in charge of. I oversee our Think Open Fellowship program, which follows kind of a fairly traditional fellowship model where we have an annual award for 6 faculty or graduate students. And what we do is we give them $1,200 and say, work together really closely with the library to build a course syllabus that's going to be open or low cost materials. We also have our Open Access Publishing Fund, which supports open access publishing via grants to cover publishing costs. And then I also advocate for OER on campus and working with folks like Jonathan Lashley, who's here with us today, statewide in Idaho. So in these kinds of presentations and talks, I often find myself referencing a graphic or something like this, where I kind of make this case about publishing and cost and the money and the value and the quality of textbooks and open resources. And I think we're all pretty familiar with these kinds of arguments. You know, we know that we need to be able to make them. We know that to be effective open rhetoricians, we need to be able to address those kind of concerns. But I also think that it kind of narrows our focus, and there's a way in which we can see some holes in the literature. So when we start looking past cost to social justice and OER and potentials in open, it's really an underexplored topic in the research and scholarship. So when I was curious about publishing on this topic and did a lit review, you know, I had several moments of just like total panic of like, maybe I'm just like the worst librarian in the world because I'm not finding very much. And like, what is happening? And then I'd come back and I'd be like, okay, so like, there's like sort of this angle, like maybe we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion from the perspective of like, well, minorities benefit because materials are lower cost. And we know minorities are often facing increased financial pressures, sort of arguments like that, but not things that really engage with sort of like a radical or subversive potential of OER and the way that we can trouble standard curriculums with it. So after doing some digging, I did find a few folks, and unfortunately we just don't have enough time to kind of cite everyone. So I do hope that folks who find this presentation interesting will check out the forthcoming article, partly just to be able to kind of get that full context. But we're going to focus on an article that Sarah Lambert wrote in 2018 called Changing Our Discourse, a distinctive social justice aligned definition of open education. And in this, she uses a number of theories of social justice and education to kind of put forward these three models of three social justice principles to consider for OER. And so I'm going to summarize them briefly. Redistributive justice, which is thinking about the kind of cost potentials. How do these reduced costs benefit people? I think this is a way that we're all more used to thinking about the social justice applications of OER. But then she also talks about recognitive justice, right? So sociocultural diversity in the open curriculum, being able to actually know that diverse learners or people with diverse identities are actually seeing themselves in that curriculum, right? And then representational justice, self-determination of marginalized people and groups to speak for themselves. And I think that this is really important, and one that was really meaningful to me is that it's not enough to have these narratives told by someone who is out of the context. It's very important that the people who the stories are about are the people who are actually telling those stories and speaking their own histories, because otherwise there's inevitable distortions even with the best of intentions. So she lays out these three principles, which I thought were very interesting. And I was curious, how did some recent projects at the University of Idaho Think Open Fellowship Program where we had focused on increasing marginalized identity representation, how did that rate on Lambert's scale? So when I came to the University of Idaho, I had a previous experience working as a digital scholarship librarian and working on this project, which is Chicana por Midrasa. And it is a digital memory collective where we collect oral histories of Chicana activists who are active now as scholars and intellectuals, and who were very active as activists in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I was familiar with the potential of digital scholarship and digital rhetorics to complicate historical narratives. So frequently in the sort of Chicano history movement, we hear a lot about the Cesar Chavez, the sort of great men, the great leaders of the movement, and women's contributions are frequently really obscured. So this is kind of a historical intervention is what we like to call it, because we're going in and recovering these histories and these evidence of all the ways in which women and queer people participated in a very macho or machismo kind of movement, right? Where we often only hear about these sort of visionary male leaders. So I was curious when I started working on these projects with folks at the University of Idaho, how can we apply that same sort of ethos? Like, we know that there are things that are missing from standard curriculums. So how can we take these sort of think open projects and say, well, if we're rewriting the curriculum anyway, if we're adjusting the curriculum anyway, how can we address some of these missing pieces? So just at a kind of a brief level, I want to take a look at some of those projects that we did. and we can kind of see how they evaluate against Lambert's scale, right? So one of our projects involved rehistorying Anna Marie Douglas. So Anna Marie Douglas is frequently just described in historical narratives as the wife of Frederick Douglass, right? So that's kind of the role that she's given, and her very important contributions to Frederick Douglass securing his own freedom, to her work all through her life as a significant organizer on the Underground Railroad, who was responsible for the freedom of hundreds of people, as well as facilitating a lot of the infrastructure that made Frederick Douglass successful. She's really reduced in these kind of historical narratives. And so she was a formative example in this work because we started exploring how can we use primary archival documents and objects to tell her story and to actually change how she's presented in this curriculum that we were using locally with 7th graders. So this is a project where we took a look at it through these kind of lenses. And basically, you know, in terms of the redistributive justice and the cost, we see that, yes, of course, this is like free content that can be remixed. But more importantly, standard curriculums don't center the lives of Black women, including extraordinary women like Douglas. And there's a kind of misogyny and misogynar in specifically marginalizing the contribution of women like Anna Marie Douglas. And there's representational justice in this because we actually worked with Anna Marie's living descendants and founders at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives to create this content. So throughout this, both Rebecca and I were very mindful that we are not Black, and Rebecca herself is a white woman and has quite a bit of privilege within that identity, and that we had to be very conscious in how we were you know, dealing with our own privilege and our own positionality in this. And so a fundamental element of this work is that collaboration with the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, which is also allowing this OER to reach a much broader audience. So I'm not going to go through all of these examples because I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the Black feminist contextualization of this work. But in each of these different examples, we basically sought to increase representation in different ways. So this English 101 curriculum attempted to generate culturally relevant examples so that our significant population of English as a second language students weren't so excluded just by the sort of cultural reference points and the kind of frequently kind of white middle class upper American viewpoints that were often assumed as a base in a lot of the rhetoric work in the typical English 101 narratives. So we intentionally and purposely sought out more content by authors of much different ranges of identities than we would typically see in that content, as well as inviting students to participate in different ways in the class. Which is also a thread that we saw in our Spanish 393 curriculum, where we invited students to do things like use tweets to imagine perspectives of different formative figures in Latin America, trying to actually just give folks a much different way of interacting with the curriculum beyond a sort of typical settler colonial narrative that is typically what we find in our standard textbooks and that we see unfortunately reproduced in a lot of our OERs at kind of a really base or broad level. So just kind of jumping back to this presentation, as I started thinking about trying to share this work, I was interested in researching the histories and the scholarly contextualization of open movements. And I noticed that frequently or rarely do we see a connection of open pedagogy to liberatory women of color feminist praxis and scholarship on education. And just to put it bluntly, I couldn't help but wonder, you know, WTF, like where are these histories? How is it that we often talk about open as something that sort of arises in the 1990s, and we're not thinking about all of these liberatory histories, especially by women of color feminism, that connect to many of the concepts that we're exploring now. So I had a particular couple of scholars in mind that popped out to me as I was reading and doing this research. Bell Hooks and Regina Austin are both intellectual foremothers to many concepts in contemporary open practice, which I think is a whole probably separate topic and area of exploration. But I specifically think the argument that I'm making is that their work also provides inspiration on how open practitioners of all professional roles might engage with OER as a space for liberatory praxis for both students and the teachers and faculty implementing that OER and challenging those limiting standard narratives. So just to kind of dive in a very brief way, and I do want to specify that I don't claim particular expertise on Black feminism. I claim inspiration and awareness via my work with sort of Brown and Latinx feminism. And so I just would like to kind of, I think it's important to contextualize that and to sort of acknowledge what my positionality is there. So bell hooks, when she talks about engaged pedagogy, this is this really intriguing concept to me that also resonates with me as a Zen Buddhist, because it basically says that, you know, you have a responsibility to engage with the work that you have as an educator in a very sort of critical or demanding way in terms of what you're asking of yourself and your own kind of development. And so bell hooks says here, progressive holistic education or engaged pedagogy is more demanding than conventional critical or feminist pedagogy. For unlike these two teaching practices, it emphasizes well-being. That means teachers must be actively committed to a process of self-actualization that promotes their own well-being if they are to teach in a manner that empowers students. And so this really resonated for me, especially as a person with a lot of marginalized identities working in a predominantly white environment. Libraries, academic libraries are something like 85% white. They are predominantly cis. They are predominantly, you know, abled people, at least superficially. And so it can be a challenging environment to have all these identities. And I like how Hooks here is saying, you know, it matters what's happening with you as the person who's delivering this content, right? Like your role as an educator partly depends, your effectiveness is partly informed by your overall own well-being. And if you're someone like me and you're implementing curriculums that are effectively violent to yourself, that's kind of a harm, right? And if you have the opportunity to engage in a different way and be co-creating or assisting in co-creating curriculum that does the opposite, that is actually an affirming or positive message, that's a very transformational thing in a way that goes much beyond sort of, you know, what we might think of as the typical potentials of OER work. Bell Hooks goes on to say, and this is all from Teaching to Transgress, and I should mention that I do have a slide with all the citations at the end, so folks, if you want to check those out, they are there. So she goes on to say, in the United States, it is rare that anyone talks about teachers in university settings as healers. And it is even more rare to hear anyone suggest that teachers have any responsibility to be self-actualized individuals. Now, obviously, this quote's a bit old. I mean, I think we've all been informed by Hooks' ways in many ways. Some of us maybe more directly, maybe other of us more sort of by how Hooks has been so impactful to the field of education. But I still think, for instance, like this is probably a fairly novel concept amongst librarians, certainly, to think of ourselves as having that kind of a profound role. And I think especially, you know, I wrote this article in 2019 and it's now 2020. And I think that this is even more true because our students are in a profoundly challenging environment. And I think it's important to kind of seize these opportunities to build ourselves and build each other up where we can. So Bell Hooks is talking about this notion of engaged pedagogy. It comes from a kind of theory of Buddhism. But I want to connect now to Regina Austin, who in her foundational Black feminist legal jurisprudence article, Sapphire Bound, calls for minority female scholars in the legal field to straightforwardly, unapologetically, and strategically use their intellectual pursuits to advocate on behalf of poor and working class minority women. And I'm citing Evans, Winters, and Esposito here because they have this article in 2010 where they argue that these ideas do come out of Austin's legal feminist work, but they are deeply relevant to all aspects of education. Even though Austin is arguing from the perspective of a woman of color with experience and interest in the legal field, her comments are also relevant to conceptual, theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical efforts in the field of education. And I think that this is really true, right? I think this is the kind of what Toni Morrison refers to as the like, it's not all just a grab bag that once you get there, you're set, right? You as a person of color, as a minority in the academy, or as a person with privilege who is seriously aligned with people of color, you have a serious obligation to think about how you wield every element of the privilege that you have to be working against some of these systemic inequalities and systemic oppressions, right? So from here, I make my own call, which is basically feels like such a small drop in the bucket compared to these other contributions. I'm almost embarrassed to sort of put my own quote up here next to these other people. But basically what I would like to propose for us as OER practitioners is that we have a responsibility to specifically and decisively center systematically marginalized people in OER content and practice. Future OER creation must recenter historically marginalized people into a new, iteratively more just narrative, or itself contribute to that marginalization. Black feminist scholars, critical educators, and decolonizers of all disciplines have shown us the way. Now it is up to us to forge a new path of intentionally engaged open pedagogy. So for further discussion, if you would like to check out this article, I go into a little bit more about the sort of unique role of libraries in supporting this kind of work. I think academic libraries have a unique role to play in inspiring and supporting faculty who might be interested in these kinds of minor interventions in the historical narrative. I also talk about this kind of the importance of this kind of work in creating hope and engagement for librarians and faculty with marginalized identities. I think it's equally important to kind of center the potential impact on students with the impact it has on the educator. So this article is forthcoming in a special edition of Library Trends Journal in early 2020. And with that, I'll say thank you for your time and attention and take your questions. And I'll also just briefly bring up this works mentioned so you can see here. Here's the complete citation for the article. It's called "It's Not Just About the Cost, Academic Libraries and Intentionally Engaged OER for Social Justice." So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We have a great audience in here. So what we're going to do is kind of look at the questions that come through in chat, and that'll be the main way. If you need to ask your question as opposed to putting it in chat, try to communicate that in chat, or Melody and I will kind of try to look through for folks who have their hands raised. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your attention and your remarks so far.
Thank you. And Marco, just so you know, there's a lot of really positive feedback, and some of the questions, somebody's asking if your article is supposed to come out in 2020 or 2021.
So it's supposed to come out in 2021. That might be a typo that I had in there. It was actually supposed to come out in the fall of this year, but it's now been bumped to early 2021.
Okay. And there are people asking for copies of your presentation.
Yeah, let me just hop over into my Google Drive and I'll just give you all the link. Normally I do a little tiny URL thing, but this one was a real seat of your pantser, if you will.
And kind of relates to that, someone's also asking for your contact information again. So if that's in the slides,
yes,
we can get that too.
Yes, sounds good. I'm not sure. Do I have a way? There we go. That's what I need. All right. So there's the presentation and my contact info. And I see someone asking something about Sketch, which I'm totally happy to load this up over there. Yeah, and thank you so much for all your positive comments, everyone. I really appreciate the feedback. This was a challenging and fun article to write, and then a fun conversation to put together for you all. So I'm just trying to browse through real quick and see if there are any questions for folks that we might want to answer. If you do have one, feel free to repop it into the chat. Someone asked, are the projects featured on your university website? Yes, they are. If you go to lib.uidaho.edu and then open, which I will also put into the chat, you can kind of navigate to them. I will say I'm a little bit behind and haven't updated for our newest crop. So actually the projects that I talk about in the paper are still up as if they're the current projects. So you can see them. And eventually I'll be able to update that with some links to our like OER common spaces, which is where we put some of the syllabus so far. Someone asked, could you say more about the Think Open projects and how you got the faculty interested in participating? Yeah, that's a great question. That's from Amanda McAndrew. And basically, we have a kind of open call for proposals where we receive usually between like 15 to 20 applications. Something that you'll notice if you look through is that we do have a couple of folks from education, which I also happen to be the education librarian. It does often seem to be that the Think Open projects come from folks who already have a little bit of association with sometimes the librarian who's coordinating it. So I had strong relationships with folks in education. So like, for instance, Rebecca Boyce and Taylor and I had already started working together on the Anna Marie Douglas OER before actually having her do a Think Open fellowship. So sometimes we might start incubating something and then folks will apply. Other times people hear about it via the publication that we're able to do in our sort of community outreach. I don't specifically advertise the Think Open fellowship as primarily a DEI sort of activity, but I do include it as one of our evaluation criteria and rubrics. So we have had folks who have done sort of more traditional adoptions where maybe they, you know, like we had a very successful adoption of an OpenStack series of physics textbooks for a bunch of our core courses in physics. So that's like really great from a cost saving potential, but we didn't necessarily see any type of sort of curriculum intervention there. So it's not a requirement, but it's certainly something that we like to see. And then just kind of given my background and my research interest, we often tend to have, I sort of start having a vibe with the faculty, and then, we start talking about, usually people have some area of sort of marginalized identity where I feel like you can kind of cultivate and develop an interest. So I feel like I've been lucky to have faculty come with a lot of that already. But I also feel that there's ways in which my own passion about it helps to kind of build it up.
Marco, I'm going to stop recording, but you are welcome to hang around and people can, if you're available to answer questions, the room will still be open.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Anastasia, no, I would say no, they were not. Idaho